Hello, welcome to Football Geeks. This evening heralds the return of a regular guest. Previously, he's waxed articulate about football in Eastern Europe, but today we switch continents and travel south to Africa, and specifically Nigeria. He's the curator of the wonderful 80s and 90s football Twitter stroke X site. It's Michael Hamlen. Hello, Michael. How are you, buddy?
Not bad, Phil. How are you?
Pretty good, mate. Pretty good, yeah. I know your beloved Brighton had a bit of a sticky one in Europe the other week, so
Yeah, we don't talk about
that. Okay, yeah. I think brevity is best here. So I mean, first things first, mate. I know you've done this on introduction a few times because you've been our guest on a number of occasions. But talk us through your football back. I'll give a little bit away because you're a Brighton fan, obviously. Talk us through a little bit through your football backstory and tell the listeners about 80s and 90s football because it's a great Twitter site.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of background of football, I discovered football like a million of us, loads of us do, just in the playground with your friends, stickers and all that sort of stuff. But yes, I come from near Brighton, so yes, Brighton fan, from the late 80s when we weren't very good, and then it got a lot worse in the 90s before it got a lot better in the sort of 2010s, and the 2000s was a little bit in between. But yes, massive football fan. And it's not just Brighton; it's everything, as you probably gathered from when we've gone through Yugoslavia and Romania and the Soviet Union. So it encompasses all football I'm interested in. It's not just club; it's international, European football, the whole package. A bit like you, Phil. Anything and everything. We're up for it and we're interested in it. In terms of the 80s and 90s football page, I think we said this before. Set this up in lockdown for something to do, and it's just sort of gone on from there. So now we feature sort of videos of goals, players, teams. We sort of try and do sort of Serie A Sunday or Team Thursday or Winger Wednesday, Manager Monday. So there's a little bit of structure to it. Normally do quite a lot of on this day sort of rewinds back from the 80s and 90s, and it's just a nostalgic site with there's no bias to it. It is what it is. It's tries and encompasses everything, and some things we get right and some things we get wrong, and bit like your site, Phil.
Exactly, mate. Yeah, you just put out a paternoster of stuff and see what sticks. And sometimes people like it, and sometimes they don't like it as much. But it's not going to stop you from doing it. And that's the we both just love it, don't we? That's the important thing.
Exactly.
But anyway, let's get into the subject for debate today, and that's Nigeria. So first things first, Mike. Talk us through the political overview of Nigeria during the time of reference that we're going to be speaking about, which is about the late 70s through to the late 90s. With a little bit of a look at beyond, but sticking within that time frame, basically, isn't it? What was Nigeria looking like as a country during that time scale?
Well, sort of Nigeria, gets full independence in sort of 1960, and then it has a cycle of civilian rule and military rule that sort of goes between sort of each other, and the military step in, take over, and then eventually civilian government comes back, and then the military government take back over again. And sort of late 70s, at the time was a civilian government. Military government comes in sort of 83, I think it is. And Nigeria is a very diverse country. It's sort of got 230 million people. If you look at Africa as a continent, it's got about 1.3, 1.4 billion as a whole. So you can work out very rough maths, sort of 15, 16, maybe 17% of all Africans are Nigerian. And it's a country that's sort of split between sort of Muslim in the north and Christian in the south, but you've got sort of 300 different ethnic groups, 500 languages, so it's a very diverse, sort of complicated country in some respects. And you could probably understand why there was a military rule, maybe to sort of put that sort of powder keg together. And when you've got civilian rule and you've got different parties involved, everyone's got their own agenda, and it doesn't necessarily always work. But in terms of what we're talking about, the 80s was a tough time, like a number of African countries in that period. But of course, Nigeria is an oil-rich country, but there was calls for sort of going back to a democracy and civilian rule and the turn of the 90s, which there was elections, and then the military annulled the elections, like the good old-fashioned military. I don't like that result, so we go back to as it was. And the 90s become a very, very dark period politically for Nigeria.
Yeah, as we've talked about countries where they, in the past, where they've tried to rein together disparate groups, and it always tends to it works better when there is totalitarian rule than when there isn't. It's an oddity, isn't it? But it's something that's repeated itself a number of times throughout history. But from a football perspective, we move away from the politics, move on to football, because really Nigeria came to the attention of the footballing world in the late 70s and 80s with some of the displays at the AFCON tournaments of that particular era. What were there any notable successes that kind of brought them into focus during that period?
I think in that period, I think Nigeria is almost like they're consistently inconsistent, and they win the sort of AFCON in 1980, and they had a couple of third finishes in 76 and 78, but they win the home tournament in 1980, beat Algeria 3-0 in the final, and they then follow that up in 82 by getting knocked out in the group stage. And then they have a period where they're runners up quite a few times. They're runners up in 84, but they don't even qualify in 86. The runners up again in 88 and 1990, but they never qualify for a World Cup in this period. And I know that obviously doesn't help. There's only 2 African sort of slots in the World Cup, which makes qualification really, really hard. And you've got a really good Cameroon team in the 80s, spearheaded by Roger Miller. But you had Morocco, that went to 86. You had Algeria that went to 82. So you had some other really good sides. And Nigeria just sort of kept falling short in the 80s, really.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was quite tough because there were a number of talented teams, like that Algeria team from '82, who were ousted in very controversial circumstances after beating West Germany and Chile in that group stage. It was all, and then '86. You had Morocco became the first African team to qualify for the second phase, so to speak. So there was a lot of competition, but it started to change after about 94, didn't it? They won the AFCON in 94, and there was, after that there was a figure who was pivotal to Nigerian football in progression, and that was a Dutchman, wasn't it? Clemens Westerhoff. Westerhoff, and he was who was he, and what was his vision of the Nigerian national team, and did he face any obstacles in pursuit of success with the Nigerian national team?
Oh, definitely, yeah. He came to sort of manage Nigeria in sort of '89, and he had a sort of good sort of spine of the team where he sort of had Peter Rufai in goal, and he had Stephen Keshi at the back, and he had Yekini up front. But he didn't have a great deal of other sort of supporting cast members. But he was a very totalitarian manager, but he also had the Dutch sort of total football, passing, moving type of European style of football. But obviously trying to integrate it into with the Nigerians, which he did really successfully. But I think what him and his assistant Joe Bonfrere, they needed to find the rest of the players. But Nigeria was actually at a time they won the youth under 17 World Cup in '85, and I looked at the squads, but those players didn't ever seem to really then progress into the national team. But it was very much that they started traveling around Nigeria, which at this time was quite dangerous, sort of going into the bush and looking for sort of watching any football they could find and trying to find players. And as they sort of traveled the country, they stumbled across sort of Daniel Amakachi, Amanike, and Ikpeba, sort of Finindi George, and JJ Okocha. And some of those players were playing in Europe as well. They sort of moved and they'd gone over there, and they sort of got scout reports. We've got a player here that you might want. So they were quite lucky. They had this really good sort of generation of players coming through, but they had to find them. They weren't knocking on their door. They had to go and find them and knock on the players' door almost. And in terms of the obstacles he faced from within, because of the way the government structure was, you have these sort of notorious sports ministers in sort of certain countries, and you found that the money was given from the president to the sports minister that went to the team, but the time the sports ministry got involved, the money that left the president doesn't get to the team, and it sort of disappears somewhere in the ether. And eventually, sort of Westerhoff went to the vice president, and literally, they were saying, why are we not qualifying for these? Why are we not winning the AFCON, and why are we not doing this? And it was like, well, it's money, it's infrastructure, and the time I get the money, most of it's gone. And that changed, and it literally was then he was then dealing directly almost with the top echelons of government. And then of course that created a lot of enemies within the sports ministry, because they were sidelined, and of course their money stream had just disappeared because it had gone to where it should have gone. so yeah, he started from scratch. He was lucky with a really good collection of players, but he had to fight against the internal sort of sports ministry to get the funds that he was allocated actually given to him.
Yeah, it's a very African story about funds being misappropriated, isn't it? I mean, the one that kind of springs to mind is Zaire during the 1974 World Cup for me. They played Scotland in the first game, and the day after they were due to go for a kind of shopping trip in Dortmund. And when they got there, they realised all the funds had been spent by the other members of the kind of travelling entourage, and that's what's said to have kind of prompted the poor performance against Yugoslavia. The players were disgruntled by that, so it wouldn't be the first time that money's been used in a way that it shouldn't be in African football. However, let's move on, or move back a little bit. The year before 1994, because disaster struck the African continent in 1993 with the Zambia air crash. Tell us the story of this dark time and how it then dovetailed into AFCON 94.
Yeah, so at this time, sort of 92, 93, Zambia were sort of emerging as Nigeria's sort of rival on the international scene, and you can always trace that back to sort of the Olympics in '88, where I think they beat Italy 4-0, and I think they came third or got bronze medal. But they had these couple of, I think they're brothers, the Whaler brothers. I think I might have said that really wrong, and if I got that wrong, I apologise. But they were really yeah, they were really good players, and they had I can't remember if it was a World Cup game or if it was an AFCON qualifier, but the team went for had a match, and as they were flying back, and they're flying on a military sort of transporter, and it crashed sort of over Gambon, and it knocked out, I think it was 8 or 9 players, but the players that were playing in Europe had gone or were traveling separate, and they didn't, unfortunately, die in the airplane crash. So sort of like Zambia's best players, or these two brothers I just alluded to, were still, they were still alive and could obviously play, but they'd obviously lost the majority of their team, which for Nigeria, I was going to sound awful, gave them an opportunity to qualify obviously for USA 94 and at the AFCON. But amazingly, Zambia managed to get to the final of AFCON 94, and they lost 2-1 to Nigeria in the final. And I think Zambia took the lead, but Amaniki, in his first ever game for Nigeria, got 2 goals and won the game, and they won sort of AFCON 94, which was Westerhoff's goal. He stated that he would win an AFCON and get Nigeria to a World Cup. So from that point of view, he'd achieved one part of what he'd said. You've got to wonder if Zambia, that crash didn't happen, would Zambia have won AFCON? Nobody knows. You can't answer that question. It's another great what if, isn't it, Phil? And it's a bit like with the World Cup qualification, Zambia nearly qualified for the World Cup, and again, if the aeroplane crash happened or didn't happen, would they have qualified for the World Cup instead of Nigeria? You can't answer that question. It's another great what if, isn't it? I think Zambia 93 is a really fascinating story, another great what if story. And it's an unknown story. A lot of people don't really know about that story and don't really talk about it.
Yeah, it's very, very poignant story. But I mean, Zambia must have been one hell of a team, because when they were in the same group as Nigeria, just eked through that group to arrive at USA 94. But when you look at the quality that's within that 94 Nigerian squad, it really says something about how good Zambia must have been around that time. Because before we went on air, we were relaying some of the players in that squad, and it's only at the time, because we had no real context, because in 94, there was still a lot of surprises, weren't there? You watched a World Cup tournament, and you still didn't know who a lot of the players were. And this Nigeria team, we'd been told about, but we'd never really seen them play. I mean, 1994, it really observed the arrival of Nigeria on the world stage, and it was a superb tournament. So talk us through that Super Eagles squad and their part in the drama of 1994.
I think as we said before we come on air, I think this is where the last World Cup where it's the players and the teams are still a surprise. And I think for me personally, I don't remember buying a sticker book for this World Cup. I think because England weren't there, I didn't have much interest. And I think as anyone you then look retrospectively at the team and the players, you literally go, that was a bloody good team. And you look at the team, and I know what he mentioned. The goalkeeper Rufai was there, and Kishi was still there. But then and Yekini, of course. But then you add the players. You got sort of Uche at the back. As an absolute sort of giant at the back, good on the ball. I think he played for Fenerbahce for a very long time, and I think Man United were interested in him, and he wasn't allowed to leave. But as I said, I just referenced Amanike and Amakachi earlier, and of course we remember Amakachi, his amazing goal against Greece, and Yekini grabbing the net and shouting against Bulgaria, and we'll talk about it a bit more. But sort of Sunday Elise and Pava, and of course Fanini George, Efan Okuku. I have to get a little reference there to Norwich and Wimbledon player, but the star, of course, is JJ Okocha. What an absolute superstar. What a great player he was.
Yeah, we talked about him before we came on air, didn't we? And it was like a magician. How he got past players and found space it was like a magic trick, because there's very few players in a modern context who can do that, and he was certainly one of them. The other one that I spoke of was one of my great favourites, and that was Roberto Donadoni, and he was like the African Donadoni. He had incredible skill, and he could find a little bit of room to work where there didn't appear to be any. So yeah, they were an incredible team. So talk us through those finals. What happened when they arrived, and how did they get there? What were the key moments? What were the great successes? Because there was a load of stuff that they contributed to that tournament, wasn't there?
Yeah, they were drawn with Bulgaria, Argentina, and Greece. So I think Argentina speaks for itself. They're always going to be there or thereabouts. And of course, they had sort of Maradona come back into the team, and he sort of started getting them there for the playoff. And the beginning of those sort of first couple of games of Maradona, until he started shouting at the camera, you sort of think, well, this Argentinian team's clicked. And again, retrospect, you look at the Argentinian team, and I've said this before. I think when we talked about Romania, that Argentinian team was a really good team. I think we're just rocked massively by what happened to Maradona. Bulgaria, I knew a Stoichkov mainly because of reading Match Magazine and 90 Minutes and shooting all those, and you sort of saw Stoichkov's name mentioned in Barcelona in the European Cup of '92. So I think you knew who Stoichkov was, and I think you just expected Bulgaria because, again, sort of European team perhaps, and Greece didn't know much about Greece, if I'm honest. But in terms of Nigeria, there's quite a big sort of Nigeria sort of population in America, and of course they all came out sort of supporting and the Nigerians, so they had quite a decent support actually. But against Bulgaria, I think if you start about that game, I think the Bulgarians came out and were quite good at first. I think they missed a chance at 2, and then of course Yekini scored. It was a great move. So the ball went out to the right hand side. It was whipped in. Yekini put it in, and that's the one. He grabs the net, and as I said, he's shaking the net and he's shouting Yekini, and I can't remember who scores in the rest of the game, the other goals, but they win 3-0. And they then go and play I think it's oh god, did they play next?
Argentina next.
Oh,
Argentina.
yeah, that's when they lost that one. That's Maradona's last game. That's it. They lost
Yeah.
Maradona's last game, and yeah, they lost that game, and then of course they then go and beat Greece 2-0, and that's the goal where the game where Amakachi scores that amazing goal, which I think earns him his move from Bruges to Everton. I think, which didn't really work out that well for Amakachi, but I think everything we all knew who Amakachi was after that goal because it was just superb. And then of course they got round to the next game, and of course they got Italy, and that was one of those games they should have won that game.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
know that they had I think Amakachi and Amaniki were injured for this game, but I think they were 1-0 up, and of course Zola got sent off, didn't he? So Zola got sent off,
Yeah.
and that's the game where Maldini brought down Yachini, where Yachini was through on goal, and Maldini should have been sent off, but only got a yellow card, which is another great, what if stories. Was that not premeditated, the wrong word, but was that, did the referee think, oh god, we can't put Italy down to 9 men? Was there a sort of narrative to say that Italy needed to win through, to go through? Who knows, but Maldini stayed on the pitch, and then of course Baggio sort of awoke from his slumber. He was in the group games, he hadn't done a great deal. I know that he'd had disagreements with Saki, and then of course he scores that goal literally right on full time. Sort of
Yeah.
just sort of swept it in the net, and I think that just killed the Nigerians. I think that they thought that they were through. I think the whole world probably thought they were through. Against 10 men, probably, and it should have been 9. And then of course extra time, Baggio goes and gets another goal. And I love Baggio. I absolutely love Baggio. But you got to feel for the Nigerians a bit in this one.
Yeah, of course. For a debut tournament, they left a huge imprint on it. I remember that first game against Bulgaria, watching it as somebody who wasn't greatly. I knew that they were regarded as a good side, but I'd never seen them play. And against Bulgaria, like you say, in the first 20 minutes, Bulgaria had a few chances, but then they swept them away. The nature that they swept them away was quite Brazilian. It was an incredible performance. And if you would have said after that game, one of these two teams is going to make it to the semi-final, you certainly wouldn't have been putting any money on Bulgaria to be that team, which of course they did become. And then you've got they lost to Italy. One of the first few times that an African team had made it beyond the group stage, and that narrow defeat to Italy. Their tournament was then considered to be a disappointment when it should have been heralded as a massive success. But anyway, they learned from that, didn't they? And they moved on with the same group of players almost to the Olympics in Atlanta in 1996. And it was a big one for Nigeria, wasn't it, Michael?
Oh god, yeah. I think that I think you almost have to reference, I think, what happened in Nigeria at this point between sort of 93, the military dictator the Abacha takes over, and of course, literally, with all the oil money, literally almost went straight into the back pocket, and there was loads of protests, and there was a real high profile sort of execution because, of course, was Ken Sioara, I think his name is, and the other guys from the protest group. And on the back of that, Nigeria almost becomes this pariah state. Sort of Nelson Mandela asked for them to be kicked out of the Commonwealth, and that's why they don't go to AFCON 96. They don't defend their title because Abacha bans them from traveling to South Africa because of the relationship he's got with Mandela. So there's lots of stuff going on at home, and there's lots of unrest. But football unites Nigeria, like it does a lot of African countries. That football unites Nigeria, and literally the Olympics was like, it's not the World Cup, but for Nigeria, this was the next thing to showcase themselves as a country, to try and make the people at home happy as much as you can, and try and deflect what's going on at home, and it's all to do football. And again, you've got the same players that pretty much go to USA 94 because they're so young. They pretty much all qualify. I think Amakachi's probably is over age, but the list of players we just talked about for USA 94. Now you add, I think he's 16. You add, Babiaro. I think he's either 16 or 17.
Yeah.
Taribo West comes through as well, and of course, Kanu. This is when Kanu appears, and Kanu makes a little bit of a name for himself in this tournament. I think, as we were talking about off air, this World Cup, to me, looking at the teams that the team that Nigeria have, and the team that they play at the end of the tournament, the collection of players in this Olympics is as good as anything you'll see. Almost, it is just. I know it's the Olympics, and the Olympics is not talked about. And I think there's a book to be written about football Olympics, actually, Phil. Just because some of the players that come through Olympics that go on to big things, and some players that have an amazing Olympics but don't go on to have great careers. I think that there's a book to be written there. I'm not saying I can write it, but I think there's definitely some knowledge in this, perhaps.
I'll tell you what. I think you might be onto one there, and we can collaborate on it, surely, because I'm sure you could bring a lot of information there. And you're right. It's an incredible. There's some incredible stories to be had there, and this is one that's amongst them, because they qualified from the group. And then, as you say, they played Brazil in what was a real humdinger of a semi-final, and the Brazilian team was virtually the Brazil. It had the core of the Brazil team from the '94 World Cup, didn't it? The world champion.
No, you're quite right. I think there was a big thing. Nigeria see Brazil as the top team, and there's nothing else. I think I was listening to a podcast doing the research, and they literally said you got Brazil and then you got God. There's nothing else. They sort of see Brazil as this amazing team, and they lost to them in the group stage, but then they played them again in the semi-final. And I think there's a really great podcast about this on what's the podcast called? I think it's called Goal, I think it is. I know Giant, and it's about the Olympics, and it goes into far more detail than we were, and it's really worth listening to. And they said they thought they were going to beat Brazil, which nobody thought that they would beat Brazil, because I know we talked about this, but look at the Brazil team. You got a young Roberto Carlos, you got Juninho, you got Savio, you got Ronaldo, the proper Ronaldo as I call him, Di Maria, and Rivaldo's there as well, and Beto. So you think, oh my God, these players I've just mentioned, what a team that is. And it literally is almost the '94 team. And then it's the most of those players go to '98. And of course, they're managed by Mario Zagallo. So you've got the World Cup manager who was the assistant in '94, the manager in '98, and he takes control of the Olympic team. So you can see for the Brazil, this is their stepping stone to World Cup in '98. But Brazil, I think they go 1-0 up, and I think Nigeria equalise, and I think then Brazil go 3-1 up, and you think Brazil are going to win. The manager substitutes Ronaldo for the final. Sort of shades there perhaps of Ramsey taking off Bobby Charlton perhaps, or other for 1970 and other sort of just substitutions that keeping players back for the next game, and that next game never comes. And I think it gets one back, and then of course Kanu scores in the last minute. I think this is Kanu's first game as well, a bit like Amanike is like his first game.
Yeah, and I think he played in one of the group. He scored in one of the group games as well. He scored against Hungary. He probably like his second game. He was reserved for this, but then he had a couple of moments in the tail end of that game, didn't he?
Yeah, and then he gets the winner, and it's golden goal, and that's the end of it. And I think that the manager had changed from Westerhoff to his assistant Joe Von Ferrer, and he was sort of saying at half time he sort of bumped into the FIFA officials, and they were sort of almost not taking Mickey out of him, but basically sort of saying, you think you're going to win, and he was like, yeah, we're going to win, we're going to ruin your final. You want Brazil to play Argentina in the Olympic final. That's the final you want. That's the final the world wants, and we're not having it. And of course they win 4-3, and then of course they then go and play Argentina in the final.
And again, it was an incredible Argentina side as well, with all the big names that went to '98 amongst those. But Batistuta was in there. I think Balbo was still there as well. There was incredible. When you look at the Brazil squad in the semi-final, and the Argentina squad, in the final. They were kind of they were incredible teams, and
Oh,
again Nigeria did them, didn't they? Did them in that
yeah, no,
final.
you're right with the players you just added. You just mentioned, but they had Ortega and they had Gallardo and they had Simeone and Claudio Lopez and Zanetti was there and Almeida. And you just think, again, like you just said, this is the World Cup team that go to '98 pretty much, and they're managed by Daniel Passarella. So again, you've got the World Cup manager in 2 years' time managing the Olympic team. So you can see the stepping stone and the glide path from the Olympics to the World Cup at this point. But they beat Argentina 3-2. Babiara, Mikachi, and Emenike. I think Emenike gets the winner in the last minute. So another high drama game. And this, to be honest, is Nigeria's finest moment in this period because USA 94 didn't go as well as it could have done. We'll talk about France 98 in a second, but this was their moment. And then, of course, this is when, again, you've got issues off the pitch where Jovan Ferrer they were undermining him. This is the sports ministry and the system at home, and they threatened to pay him not in sort of dollars and pay him in sort of local currency, which was worthless. And there was issues with training, and there was issues with kits, and there was issues with hotels because they ended up staying in a motel, and they ended up eating in Chinese restaurants and having their food brought to them, all because they weren't supported from the Football Federation and the Olympic Federation at home. They weren't given any favours from the Olympics and FIFA because, again, they didn't want this final. They wanted the showcase final between Argentina and Brazil, and that's what Jovan Ferrer has publicly stated and said. And then, of course, to rub more insult into injuries, that the manager or the coach didn't get the gold medal. The sports minister whipped the gold medal away in true African sort of style, and was like, "Oh, took the credit and the praise and took the gold medal," which is just unbelievable.
Yeah, you can't believe that those things would be allowed to happen, but they were. But off the back of the 96 Olympics, they were no longer a surprise moving forward, were they? At Nigeria, we knew about them, and then of course World Cup '98 came about, didn't it? And they went in. They were in a particularly difficult group, to be fair. I'll let you talk about it. You tell the listeners about.
Yeah, you're right. They did have a difficult group. They had sort of Spain, Bulgaria again, and Paraguay. So this is the Paraguay with Chilavert in goal, and I think everyone was talking about him because he was this absolute fruitcake, wasn't he? But he scored these goals from penalties, free kicks, almost anywhere on the pitch, and he was the goalie. He was almost like Higuita and some. He was almost like the next level. Sort of Bulgaria again. Bulgaria are an unknown package or quantity at all at this point. They've had 94, they've had Euro 96, and of course, that a lot of those players. Then we know who those players are. And Spain, again, always flattered to see, but had a good side. Sort of Raul, I think, was supposed to be the main star for this team and have a really, really good World Cup. And I think he scored couple of goals, but again, it didn't work out for Spain as per usual. But that first, I think the Spain game was the first game. I remember watching this on a Saturday lunch. I'm sure it was a Saturday lunchtime on ITV. Yeah. And that was the one where Sandilisi scores an absolute screamer from outside the box. Zubaretta, I think, wishes he can just forget about that game because he had an absolute shocker. And so they beat Spain 3-2, beat Bulgaria 1-0. And then lose to Paraguay. And is that because they thought they're good as qualified and just took the foot off the gas? Was it because Paraguay play France, don't they? So were they looking at the France thinking, don't fancy playing France? We'll play the other team, whoever that is, because that might be slightly easier team. And of course, he doesn't end up being an easier game by any means. And the squad again is pretty much identical from the Olympics, and then sort of players from '94. But I think you've got Babangida, I think, appears at this one as well, another sort of great player, another great winger. And but then of course they go to the round 16, and it all comes crashing down against Denmark.
Yeah, they lost quite heavily, but it's like it's talked about before, that Paraguay game. after the incredible momentum built after the Spain game, which they sort of won in spite of themselves, because Spain had several chances to put it beyond reach, but then you say there was that awful Zubizarreta moment, and then Sunday Elise wraps one in from about 30 yards, and suddenly Spain have lost the game. But then they comfortably beat Bulgaria. It was a 1-0 win, but it was it was as convincing as a 1-0 win could be. So they're almost on the brink of qualification, and then this Paraguay game kind of puts a kind of pin in the balloon, and all that momentum's lost. And then they go into the Denmark game, and they just can't retrieve that kind of that magic they showed in the first two games, can they?
No, when I call your name, sort of Peter Miller scores in the first few minutes. Brian Laudrup gets a second after about sort of 12, 13 minutes, and they're 2-0 down after 12 minutes. But Nigeria have come back from this before in the Olympics and other games, and they do have a habit of going a goal behind and coming back. But they just didn't, and they just the second half Sand scores, and then Thomas Helfig scores, and they're 4-0 down. And Babangida scores almost instantly after that. But there's only sort of 12 minutes left, and that's the end of that. And I think listening to sort of various podcasts that I've listened to, sort of Babiaro's on, states that I think there was complacency set in. I think the sports ministry almost thought that this team was so good they didn't need a coach. So they got rid of the other coach, Joe Bonfer had left, and absolutely icon of a manager, with Boran Milutinovic comes in, but it couldn't work his magic with this team either. And you think, the players we've talked about throughout this, they're all playing for decent, they're all playing for European clubs now, top European club sides, and I think they know how much this means to the people back at home, but it just doesn't happen for them. And how much of that's down to distractions off the pitch, infighting, I really don't know. But it just all comes down, and they should have beaten that Denmark team. And don't get me wrong, the Denmark team was a good team. You still had the Laudrup brothers. This is Michael Laudrup's last sort of tournament, because he retires after this, doesn't he? And you sort of, as I said, Helfig is a good player, and John Tyle Thomas. Was John Tyle Thomas around at that point? I can't remember. But they had some decent players, but not of this level that Nigeria had.
No, I mean it's odd, because would you say? If they would have beat Denmark, ironically, they would have played Brazil in the quarterfinals as well. So it would have been a repeat of the semi from the Olympics. But would you say? I think I know what the answer is going to be. That this was probably the finest African team to compete in a World Cup.
I think looking at it from a 1 to 11 and the bench, I'd probably say yes. I think you could probably argue that some teams may have had a better individual player, maybe, but even so, that's to try and find something better than JJ Okocha is quite hard. But you look at something like a Samuel Eto'o or a Drogba or players like that, and I know that Ivory Coast team in the 2000s was a really, really good team with some really, really good players. But you look at the players we talked about, I think this Nigeria team is another level. I'm open to debate on that. I'm open to be proved wrong, but I think that Nigeria team just fell short and underachieved.
Yeah, I would say they had the potential to be world champions, which seems incredible from an African perspective, because not many teams have ascended to that height. And it was a shame, because post 98 heralded a decline in the national team, a big decline, and it's a transition they've struggled to recover from, isn't it, Michael?
No, I agree that the sort of the next tournament for them is AFCON 2000, and they lose a home tournament. They're at home and they lose to Cameroon in the final, which finishes 2-2. And again, this is, I think, when Cameroon starts re-emerging, where I think you had the sort of 1990 sort of peak of Cameroon with that team and getting to the quarterfinals against England. I know it goes to USA 94, but it was just sort of one step too far. But that Cameroon team, you've got sort of Jeremy, Patrick Umba, Vivian Foe and Joe's Dariah Job, Samuel Eto'o, of course, a really good emerging team. Rigobert Song was playing with Liverpool at the time. And that Nigeria team, again, pretty much the same team. I think the other player who sort of when I was looking at this is Julius Agahauer, and I think if anyone who played Championship Manager 2001, 2002 remember him because he was an absolute bargain. It was a goal machine. But yeah, then Joe Bonfrere returned for this as well. So you think you've got the manager the players loved from '96, and you think the home tournament would give them an advantage. But again, I think they're just up against Cameroon, and AFCON 2002. They lost the semi-final to Senegal, and of course, this is another team that's emerging, isn't it? They go to the World Cup 2002, beat France. They've got Enaf Diouf and Baba Diop and all those other players that come through. So again, you've got some really good emerging teams as well that have come through, that are young and hungry as well. Similar sort of political situation and the poverty and all those things that you sort of get with sort of sub-Saharan Africa, and of course then they go to the World Cup 2002. They're in the old group of death with England, Argentina, and Sweden, and that doesn't work out either. And yeah, they just, that sort of generation, a golden generation of players, just sort of fizzles out really, and they haven't really hit the heights since. You sometimes you think you've got another dawn of another group of players perhaps, or they get a good result, but the collection of players that we talked about today just isn't there.
Yeah, they're still waiting for their new golden generation, if that will ever come. I mean, as you say, it's difficult to pick players in such a vast country with such a kind of limited coaching and scouting kind of operation in place. But what specifically do you think the legacy of that Nigeria team is or was? I mean, it certainly made Africa dream big as a continent, didn't it?
Oh yeah, I agree with that. I think from a legacy, I think that I know that when they won the Olympics in '96, I think 5 other African countries had a sort of day of celebration almost, although they didn't even win the Olympics, but it was just what it represented, what it meant for Africa. And I think Cameroon are the country that puts Africa on the map in 1990, and of course they get an extra slot. They get 3 teams, and I think we talked about that earlier on, for USA '94. But I think this Nigeria team, with the sort of dancing on the pitch and in the crowd, and I think it goes to another level. And I think also the advantage that Nigeria have is you sort of go into a period where you've got much more coverage, and the internet starts appearing sort of mid '90s and towards the end of the '90s into sort of 2000s. But it's a difficult one, because it doesn't necessarily seem to inspire a next generation of players for Nigeria to come through. Yes, you get the odd couple of players, don't you? Like Osimhen's like the current one for Nigeria, isn't it? But
yeah.
But it almost inspires the other countries like Ivory Coast and Ghana and the other countries and Senegal, like we talked about. So it's almost like the other countries are taking note of Nigeria and always thinking, well, we want a bit of that. And I know that it's very difficult when you are with international football, that you are literally governed almost by the biology of the parents at that time and what comes through and what appears, isn't it? And I think, like we said, it's difficult in a country like Nigeria and a number of other countries because it's so big and vast. If you're an absolute superstar and you are in the bush somewhere and you've got no way of being found, no way of traveling to Lagos or anywhere else to get noticed, you almost fall by the wayside perhaps. But it's a really difficult one. I think in terms of legacy, I think the fact we're still talking about it and getting excited about it, I think goes to show what it goes to prove that they did something quite special and quite memorable back in the day.
Definitely, Matt. I mean, these African nations seem to have it seems to work in cycles, doesn't it? So, and hopefully Nigeria will find that new generation somewhere in the future. Margaret, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you again, and thank you for casting light on that kind of era in footballing history. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. So, but guys, thanks for listening in, and we'll see you next time on Football Geeks. Bye for now, everyone.
Thank you.